Once a month, when the moon reaches its highest point in the sky and the wild creatures call out to the night, he emerges from a private sanctuary in an undisclosed location outside of Little Rock, Arkansas. Arrayed in his priestly vestments, carrying forth the good news that comic books and graphic novels aren't just for kids, that they aren't just mass and spandex superheroes, that storytelling in a graphic format can be so much more. He is the Graphic Novel Apostle.
Hello and welcome back to the Graphic Novel Apostle podcast. I'm your host, Mark Ohrenberger. I'm thrilled to be with you here this Tuesday morning. Different day for us than usual, but it seems like it could be a stressful day in America, so why not? Let's have a little bit of comic book talk to lighten up the day just a little bit. So this week, I want to start out by talking about the Memphis Comic Expo, do a little bit of recap on my experience there last weekend, which was fantastic, and then I want to talk about two books from Ghost Machine. These are two new horror/sci-fi titles, Hyde Street and then a one-shot spin-off, It Happened on Hyde Street, Devour. So we'll get to those in a few minutes. But first, so we were wrapping up Halloween this last week, and I want to tell you guys this story. It was this past Wednesday, and Natalie and Garrett and I had gone out to dinner. And on the way, we were talking about Halloween and Halloween stories, and Natalie, for having no interest whatsoever in comic books, is pretty good about being kind enough to listen to her husband on his podcast once in a while, although she was a little bit behind, and so she said that she hadn't heard the episode yet where we talked about the story Take One by Chris Burnham, which was in Volume 1, Issue 1 of Creepshow. And I thought, man, that's such a perfect Halloween story. They really ought to hear it to get into the spirit of things, night before Halloween and all. So we went and we had our dinner, and on the way back, we get in the car, and I said, okay, guys, I'm going to make you listen to this. And so we turn on my podcast, and I forwarded it to the point where we started talking about that story, Take One, by Chris Burnham. And by the way, if you want to hear that for yourself, that's just 2 episodes back in the feed. So we sit there in the car for a few minutes as we're driving home, and we listen to the story. And it gets done, and I just kind of smile to myself there in the dark, and pause the show. And I said, so guys, what'd you think? Isn't that a cool story? And I hear Garrett from the back seat. He's just had his 10th birthday. And he said, Dad, why did you make me listen to that? And I said, oh no, buddy, did you think that was scary? It hadn't crossed my mind that it would come across that way. And he said, I don't want to think about it. And I was like, oh no, I feel bad. Well, then I look over at Natalie in the passenger seat who hasn't said anything at all. And I was like, hun, everything okay? And she didn't really say anything. And I was like, you thought that was scary too? And she goes, uh-huh. So I hope I have not traumatized anybody else's family, maybe just my own. But hey, would it be Halloween if you didn't have a good scare? And so with my apologies to my beloved wife and son, thank you very much for listening to the podcast. I'm sorry I scared you, but I'm glad we had a great Halloween all the same. Hey, before we get into the subjects that I wanted to cover this week, let me just let you all know in advance that next week we will have my buddy Michael Crump on as a guest. I've been looking forward to doing an episode with him for a while, and we are going to cover the book True Cult. And if you want to look it up to read that book ahead of time and join us as we go through that conversation, that is spelled TRVEKVLT. And if your local public library has Hoopla available for its members, this book is available on there. That book is by Scott Bryan Wilson, with art by Liana Kangas, who is someone I want to talk about now. I want to get into the Memphis Comic Expo. So here, just outside of Little Rock, I'm about 120 miles. It's basically a 2-hour drive over to Memphis. Last year, I'd gone to the Memphis Comic Expo, and it was my first comic convention to go to. I was really excited about it because it is one that is really focused on comic creators. They have a few voice actor guests and some other pop culture type of stuff, but the real focus of the convention is on comic book artists and comic book writers. And it was such a good experience last year that I could not wait to go back again this year. I think from the day they announced the dates that it was going to be this fall, I had them on my calendar. I had gotten things lined up with my in-laws to keep Garrett for the weekend, so I'd be able to come. Unfortunately, this is not the kind of thing that interests him very much at this point in his life. He'll come around. But anyway, I was going to be there, And I was, and it was great. So I want to talk for just a minute about a handful of creators that I got to meet and some of the different books that I got either to get signed that I already had or that I picked up while I was there. And I'll have pictures on our Instagram account to go along with a lot of this. So that is at Graphic Novel Apostle on Instagram. And always just a reminder as well, if you want to get in touch with us by email, it's graphicnovelapostle@gmail.com. So last year when I'd gone to Memphis Comic Expo, one of the first artists that I met was Liana Kangas. And as I approached their table, Liana saw that I had a copy of True Cult in my hand and said, "Oh, please come over here, let me sign that for you." And then couldn't be nicer to me. I wasn't quite sure at that point how to, go about asking for the autographs and interacting with the creators, how much they'd care to talk about their work or whether they just wanted to sign things and have you move on. And Liana was so nice to me, it really kind of helped break the ice for the convention. And with them being a Memphis-based artist as well, I felt like, you know what, this is someone who does good artwork, someone who is semi-local to where I'm from. And so I've paid attention to Liana's career, which has gone through the roof this past year, and I've been so happy for them. And so several months back, I got in contact with Liana's assistant to see about Liana doing a sketch cover for me that I could pick up at the comic convention this year. And we did that. Now, I talked back in episode 5A about how much I love Dick Tracy, that old 1990 movie, and also the new Dick Tracy series that's been coming out recently from Mad Cave. When that book started to come out, I collected a bunch of the variant covers for issue number 1, and I also got a blank variant cover. And so I'd arranged with Liana through their assistant to get a sketch cover done, and I am so happy with how it came out. It's this great drawing, sort of a bust-type sketch of Dick Tracy in full color, so you got his classic yellow hat, and it just looks fantastic. And so when I was able to go there and pick that up from Liana, I had a great talk with them, visited about a bunch of different projects that they've worked on over the last year, and that was really cool. I should also say, while I'm talking about Dick Tracy, you guys might have already seen this, but I put up a reel the other day on the Instagram account. Artist Brent Schoonover did variant covers for each of the first 5 issues, and they were connecting covers. So when you lay them all down side by side, there'll be, say a piece of a character's elbow that ends on the front of one cover, and on the next month's cover, you kind of get the rest of that, and so it flows from one into the next. So I got in contact with Brent through his Instagram account and asked him if he was interested in selling a signed copy of all 5 of his variant covers from the first arc of that series. He was, and he was also agreeable to do some remarks for me on each of those. And this is not something I was familiar with until maybe a year and a half ago either. So let me just tell you, if you don't know, a remark is when an artist will take a comic book and, in addition to signing it, actually do a drawing on top of the cover that's already there. It could be another character, it could be the same character that appears on the cover, but it's just an added little piece of art that makes it sort of special. And Brent did remarks on each of those first 5 issues for me, and I got those last week, and I put up that reel showing off those covers. They are so cool. I'm so happy to add those things to my collection as well. So those were a couple of big scores. Brent wasn't at the convention. I'd worked with him through the mail on that. Another one of the creators that I was really excited to go and meet, and for a lot of these folks, it's like, I just want to go and shake their hand and tell them, you did something this year that I really, really enjoyed. And DC Comics, I guess it's probably 2 years ago now, did a series of features on some of Batman's greatest villains from his Rogues Gallery, where they had a different writer and artist team on each oversized single-issue story. It was called Batman One Bad Day, and they kicked off that series with a feature on the Riddler from writer Tom King and artist Mitch Gerads, who are known to work together frequently and do such great work together. That Riddler book was phenomenal, and so I got to meet Mitch, and I had both my single-issue floppy copy that I wanted to get him to sign, and also my hardcover of that book. And when I handed him my hardcover, just asked him to sign it for me, but he picked it up and he opened it up to this black page that was, before the title page in the interior. and he drew this really cool sketch of Batman in a gold marker. It looked awesome, and it's just something I'm really excited to have, and I've got a picture of that up on our Instagram account also. Another creator I had a chance to interact with for a few minutes was Ron Marz. You know, for as much as this podcast is really a feature on indie comics, I still love Marvel and DC comic books, and my favorite character of all of them is the Silver Surfer. And Ron Marz, as a writer, together with his partner Ron Lim, the artist, have done so many fantastic Silver Surfer stories over the years. And I mean, you know, going back to the 90s, right up to stories that came out this past year. And so I had a bunch of different variant covers from Silver Surfer issues that Ron Marz and Ron Lim had done together, and I got Ron to sign several of those for me. He was really gracious about it. Also, he has a cool looking signature that shows up really well on the page, and so I was pretty excited to get a few of those, and of course they'll be up on the Instagram page also. Next, there's a cover artist named Maria Wolf, who I got to meet back in the spring at Planet Comic-Con. She does these really intricate covers for different books, and so I visited with her for like 20 minutes. She was so nice, and I picked up a copy of Beneath the Trees Where Nobody Sees #1 that she did a variant for, as well as Detective Comics number 1084. I should tell you that Beneath the Trees Where Nobody Sees is definitely a comic that we are going to feature in a full episode where I bring on a guest and we talk about the book together. I also had a chance to meet Gary Brown. Back on episode 8 of the podcast, I talked about a new comic series that's coming out this year called Falling in Love on the Path to Hell that was written by Jerry Duggan, and Gary Brown had done the art on it. And so it was really cool to, go and talk to him a little bit and tell him that, hey man, I liked your book enough that I talked about it some on my podcast. I just think that's a neat thing to share. Anyway, it was a terrific experience. I had a great day over there in Memphis. After I got done doing all the things I wanted to do at the convention for the day, I drove over to Jonesboro, about 45 minutes, an hour away from there, and got to see the Arkansas State Red Wolves beat Troy in an intense football game that came right down to the wire. So that was a really great Saturday. And while I'm at it, I should also add the Arkansas State Red Wolves men's basketball team had their season opener at home last night against Akron and pulled out a great win in overtime. Excellent way to start the series, so way to go, guys. All right, let's talk comics for a few minutes. Specifically, I want to talk about 2 new books that came out in the last month or so from Ghost Machine and Image Comics. So, about a year ago, a number of creators who were well known for working on big Marvel or DC stories announced that they were going to start their own company called Ghost Machine, with Geoff Johns being sort of the lead force behind this group of artists and writers, and that they were going to start their own publishing company and that they would release their books through Image Comics. And part of what the Ghost Machine founders indicated they were going to do was have a couple of different shared universes that different creators' books could interact with one another, and they would be different types of universes. One of them would be a horror universe. And so this book, the first one that I want to talk about, Hyde Street, is the first in that horror universe. Although I'll say this is probably as much a sci-fi book, or has the feeling of classic sci-fi as it does horror. So just to give you the credits on this is Hyde Street #1 that we're going to talk about. It's credited as Storytellers, Geoff Johns, and Ivan Reis. Inks on the book were done by Danny Miki, colors by Brad Anderson, and letters by Rob Leigh. I'm going to read this introductory paragraph that appears at the front of the first issue, and imagine it as Rod Serling telling you at the beginning of an episode of The Twilight Zone about what to expect. It reads, "There is a street just right around the corner, both familiar and unknown. A street branching off every small town square and cutting through every big city avenue. It is a place where the wicked and the cruel are drawn to the crossroads of morality and madness, with the inevitable destination of not merely death, but something far worse. This is the street of men and monsters. It is a place we call Hyde Street." I love it. Great opening. And as this first issue opens, we have this older woman carrying her groceries down the street. It looks like she's headed home. And she looks up and discovers that she's going to have to detour from her regular walk home because there's all this road construction going on. And as she seems to be a little confused about where to turn next, suddenly there's a young boy in a scouting uniform, and he approaches her and he wants to help her cross the street and carry her groceries back to her house. We're going to learn later this boy's name is Pranky, or at least that's what he goes by. And he and the older woman are talking about their families and where they're from. And in the middle of what seems to be a pretty pleasant conversation, the boy's eyes turn like a solid black and purple kind of color, where there's no longer any whites in the eyes. And his word balloons go from regular white word balloons to red with a jagged outline to them. And he says to her, "What are you hiding?" Which is obviously quite startling for this woman. And then looking into her grocery sack, where once there were groceries, now it appears that there's nothing but bottles of cyanide. And she drops the bag and these cyanide bottles burst open and they start sort of fuming and burning in a puddle on the ground. And she's scared by this and doesn't know what to think. And while all this is happening, the boy starts telling her that he knows what she's hiding, about how she had poisoned her own daughter and husband, and how she'd done it with cyanide mixed into their food over a period of time. The woman starts to panic, and she denies what has happened, and she's yelling for mercy, and then out of nowhere, a steamroller comes down the street and just flattens her. And with that intro, that disturbing intro, we know what kind of book we're dealing with. And then there's one last thing that happens in this opening scene. This boy in his scouting uniform suddenly has a new merit badge that appears on his sash, pretty much out of nowhere. And there's this counter that rings up a score of 18,231, quote, deliveries. We are not told where this badge has come from. We're not told what these deliveries are, at least for the moment. Well, it's not long before another character walks up to this boy. This is a man known as Mr. X-Ray, and it's clear that Mr. X-Ray and Pranky know each other. They have this short exchange about the rules and the norms of what's supposed to happen on Hyde Street. So Mr. X-Ray says that the goal is not death, it's damnation. And if the old woman had just asked for forgiveness, she would have escaped. And then Mr. X-Ray also says that there's an understanding that the first person to greet someone who turns down Hyde Street has the right to either guide or misguide that individual as they choose. And so he feels like Pranky has made a breach of that. Apparently Mr. X-Ray had seen her or encountered her first. But we also learned that there are these sort of permanent denizens of Hyde Street, and they are known as the residents. And that all of them had a life before coming to and being stuck on Hyde Street. And then the next thing we get is Mr. X-Ray's origin story about who and what he was before he ended up trapped on Hyde Street. We go back to the 1960s. He was a Madison Avenue marketing guy, and he was a crooked actor. He was basically a con man who scammed children out of money by selling products like X-ray glasses and other kinds of rip-off gimmicks because he saw children as suckers and adults as being people who were harder to part with their money. We also learned that he'd been caught embezzling from a former employer, and then in the midst of all this, a little girl had turned up on his doorstep, and she says that she's his daughter, that her mom had died and left her in the care of a cruel and abusive relative, and she wants to come live with Mr. X-Ray now. Well, Mr. X-Ray yells at her, and he tells her, "Stop calling me daddy, and you can't stay with me." And the girl screams, and she runs off. Well, pretty quickly, Mr. X-Ray realizes that he's done something pretty terrible, and he goes running out of his apartment building and onto the street, and he's trying to catch up with this poor girl and figure out, something better than yelling at her, telling her not to call him daddy, and turning her away back to an abusive home situation. But when he does so, he realizes he doesn't recognize where he is. Once he gets outside of his apartment building, he's on a street he doesn't recognize. Well, he's now on Hyde Street, where he's going to be stuck for a very long time. Also, something kind of neat, in the background of one panel as Mr. X-Ray finds himself out on Hyde Street, we see this storefront behind him, and it's called Fat Free. And then we also see, in word balloons coming out of the window from inside that shop, we catch a snippet of a conversation between the store clerk and a patron. And it's part of a conversation that's going to show up again in the book Devour that we're going to talk about in just a minute. So that's kind of a neat tie-in to our one-shot that followed by a couple of weeks after the release of this issue 1 of Hyde Street. Well, as we wrap up this first issue, Mr. X-Ray tells us that we will soon learn the stories of the other residents of Hyde Street, but he tells us also that there's one figure who has no story and who is more evil than any of the others that appear on Hyde Street. This person is known only as the scorekeeper and apparently is unseen. As far as we can judge, it seems like the scorekeeper is manipulating everyone and everything on Hyde Street to do his bidding, and has convinced the residents somehow that they can find a way back to their old lives in exchange for providing service to him. Now, we don't know what it is that the scorekeeper really wants, other than that he wants the death and damnation of souls that wander onto Hyde Street. But we don't know the why behind it, so that's something we'll have to explore in the coming issues. And on the very last page of issue 1, we see that Mr. X-Ray and Pranky are both being watched on some kind of monitor. And there's also this giant scoreboard marking, quote, deliveries of the residents, including a resident called Miss Goodbody, who we're going to meet now in the Devour one-shot. So if you're not familiar with a one-shot, the idea is this. It is a story that begins and ends in a single issue. It's a title completely unto itself. It could be related to another ongoing title. It could be a story that just stands completely on its own that a publisher decides to release that way. In this case, the folks over at Ghost Machine and Image decided to do a spin-off from Hyde Street with this one-shot book called It Happened on Hyde Street, Devour. And so the credits for this book, the creators listed are Maytal, Zchut, and Leila, colors by Alex Sinclair, letters by Rob Leigh, the cover art done by Ivan Reis, Danny Miki, and Brad Anderson, and of course published by Ghost Machine and Image Comics. So the year now is 1983. We see that same storefront, fat-free, that we had seen in that last issue of Hyde Street. And we have an overweight, middle-aged woman who happens upon the grand opening of this store. And as she approaches the store to go in and find out more about it, we see her crossing the street, and we happen to see that Mr. X-Ray is crossing the street in a different direction, and Pranky is on the sidewalk off to the side on his bicycle. And so the tie-ins are all there. This woman goes inside, and she visits with the store clerk, who's a younger woman, and she's wearing a very classic 1980s pink warm-up suit. And she introduces herself as Miss Goodbody. And after Miss Goodbody and this woman who is looking around, browsing in the store, visit for a few minutes, and the shopper has said that, ever since she had her daughter, she'd never really been able to keep the weight off, no matter what kind of diet or exercise she had tried, and that she'd tried basically everything she could think of, and nothing seemed to work for her. Well, Miss Goodbody has a solution, something for special cases like this woman's. And although the store wouldn't usually sell this product, they'll do it for her. And so Ms. Goodbody goes into a cupboard and pulls out a big jar that's labeled Devour and tells her that she'll only need one. Guys, for as much as we usually spoil all the stories here on this podcast, I think I don't want to spoil this one. I'll say this ends up being a generational tale that's going to bring in this woman's daughter, her granddaughter, and eventually even her great-granddaughter, as the plot moves forward up to today. It deals with issues of self-image and self-worth, and also how sort of the trauma of a poor self-image and low self-esteem can be passed along to the next generation and the generation beyond that. But this is a horror sci-fi tale, so it also has what I'll call otherworldly type consequences for the members of this poor family. It is a very engrossing story. If any of this sounds interesting to you and not too creepy, I would encourage you to go out and pick up It Happened on Hyde Street, Devour, the one-shot that came out this past week. Anyway, gang, that's all I've got for today. I want to thank you so much for listening to the podcast, as always. I'm looking forward to being back next week with another one of our full episodes, where my friend Michael Crump and I will sit down and have a conversation about true cult. I'll look forward to being with you all then, and until then, keep reading those comics.